Welcome to CrimePod Castle, the podcast where we dive into India's dark side, the really disturbing crime stories. And this is our Unsolved Mystery of India series, Episode 9. Today's story is about the Jalgaon Sex Scandal, a case that really left, a community shattered, haunted, really.
It's a case that
Yeah.
really started with just like these whispers, right?
Yeah.
These murmurs of discontent in this town, Jalgaon, back in 1994.
Okay, so Jalgaon, 1994.
Young women, they started coming forward saying they'd been exploited, abused, but their voices
What happened?
met with silence.
Oh.
Almost like society itself was trying to just bury their stories,
It's a recurring thing, isn't it?
It is, unfortunately.
Especially when the accused, if they have power in the community.
Exactly.
It takes a lot of bravery for victims to speak out,
Absolutely.
knowing they might face disbelief.
Or even like retaliation.
It's a huge risk. Yeah. But in Jalgaon, as more and more victims came forward, there's this chilling pattern, this pattern of exploitation.
Yeah, a system almost.
Yeah.
And many of these victims, they came from really tough backgrounds.
Like impoverished.
Yeah, impoverished. They were lured in, you see, with these promises of help, jobs, financial support, a way out.
Out of their situation.
Out of their desperate situations, exactly. But those promises,
They didn't.
they turned into a nightmare. They were trapped, forced into these sexual acts,
Oh, gosh.
often documented through photos or recordings.
Used against them.
Yeah, and then blackmailed into silence. So it wasn't just like isolated incidents.
It was like plans.
It was a system designed to trap them
Right.
and exploit them.
And the fact that this network, right, the abusers, allegedly included influential businessmen,
Yeah.
politicians,
Even law enforcement.
law enforcement officials.
Yeah.
It's horrifying.
Makes it even more
The
horrifying.
level of corruption.
Abuse of power.
Staggering. How could this go on for so long?
Right. Right under everyone's noses.
And the fact that those who are, they're supposed to be upholding the law,
Right.
some victims reported being turned away by them.
By the very people who should have protected them.
Yeah.
It just shows how deep this network was.
And how scared the victims must have been.
Absolutely. Who could they turn to?
It's just heartbreaking. And it makes you think, how could this go unnoticed for so long?
Well, there were whispers, right?
There had to be.
Rumors.
In the community.
Yeah, but fear kept a lot of people silent.
Because these perpetrators,
Powerful people.
influential,
Speaking out against them.
could have.
Serious consequences.
So what finally, what broke this silence?
It took a lot of courage,
Yeah.
not just from the victims, from those who refused to let these crimes go unpunished.
Okay.
So some victims, with help from local activists,
Right.
connected with journalists
Outside of.
outside of Jalgaon,
So they could.
who would listen and amplify their voices.
So the media played a part in this.
A crucial role, bringing this to national attention.
So how did that happen?
The media coverage.
Yeah.
It was relentless.
Shining a light on.
The dark side of Jalgaon,
Yeah.
forcing authorities to actually,
Take action.
take action. And the public,
Outraged.
outraged, they demanded a thorough investigation. And what they uncovered, shocking.
What did they find?
Over 300
Here you go.
cases of sexual exploitation, abuse.
Oh my gosh.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg, really.
So the real number.
Much higher.
Wow. 300 cases.
Mm,
It's unimaginable. The scale of the suffering.
yeah.
And to think.
And many of these cases, they involved young girls,
Really young.
some barely teenagers,
Whose lives were just.
changed forever by
Yeah.
what they went through.
It shows how vulnerable children are.
Right.
And the consequences.
Right.
When they're not protected. So with all this outrage,
Yeah.
right, and evidence, did those responsible actually face justice?
Well, that's where the story takes another turn.
Oh no.
Yeah. The path to justice.
Not easy.
Not straightforward at all.
I figured, right. Because we're talking about powerful people. People with a lot to lose.
Exactly. They had the means
That motive.
to protect themselves.
Silence their accusers.
Witnesses were threatened. Evidence disappeared. Victims were pressured to take back their statements. It's the same tactics that allowed these abusers to operate for so long.
That's awful. So even after being exposed,
They still had influence.
it's sickening to think they still had that power.
It shows how deep this corruption really was.
So how did the victims and those fighting for them, how did they respond to all this pressure? to bury the truth. Did they give up? Or did they push back?
They fought back. They refused to be silenced.
Right.
Despite the threats, the intimidation, the pressure to just back down the victims, their supporters, they stood firm.
It's inspiring, honestly. They didn't give up.
No. They knew that if they stayed silent, it would just embolden these abusers, give them, a free pass to continue.
So they kept fighting for justice. But I can only imagine what that must have been like for them, emotionally. Having to relive all that trauma.
Reliving the trauma, yeah. Confronting their abusers in court.
In dealing with the legal system.
Oh, yeah. That's a whole other beast.
It's not always easy.
The trial, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
Grueling process.
I bet.
Delays, legal maneuvering, attempts to discredit the victims. It was, the power dynamics were just really skewed in favor of the accused,
Because they had the resources.
Money, connections, best legal representation.
And they could use that too.
Try to sway public opinion, intimidate witnesses. It was a demonstration of how deep this network of power really went.
So even after the scandal broke,
they still had the upper hand.
How did the prosecution even begin to build a case?
Monumental task. A lot of these crimes, right, they happen behind closed doors. Fear kept the victims silent for years, gathering evidence, convincing witnesses to come forward. It wasn't easy. And to overcome, those attempts to obstruct justice. They really had to piece together a case meticulously,
relying on the courage
of the victims who were willing to testify, and the activists who documented everything, and of course, the media and the public who demanded justice.
So it sounds like a lot of people came together.
Absolutely. A collective effort.
So they had a case.
Yeah.
But getting convictions, I imagine it was a challenge.
Against these influential figures.
Yeah.
Was the Indian justice system even equipped to handle something like this?
It's a good question.
It is. On paper, the system is supposed to be fair,
right.
impartial. But the reality, power and influence, they often play a role.
So it's not always about justice.
Not always.
Yeah.
In cases like this, it gets really complex. The accused, they leverage their wealth, their connections to try to influence the outcome.
So how did it actually unfold?
Well, the trial itself was a media spectacle, of course.
Every little detail scrutinized.
Absolutely. And the courtroom became this battleground between those seeking justice and those clinging to power.
Did the defense try to, undermine the prosecution?
Numerous times, they tried to paint the victims as unreliable, suggesting they were motivated by, money or revenge. They attacked their character.
Victim blaming?
Yeah, to shift the focus away from the actions of the accused.
It's awful, but it happens. So how did the victims and those supporting them, how did they deal with that?
They were strong, resilient. They wouldn't be bullied, intimidated. They knew their voices were important.
For justice to be served.
For themselves and for other victims. They were setting an example for other survivors to come forward.
Powerful. One person speaking out can inspire others. So did the prosecution? Did they manage to make their case? What happened?
They did, despite the obstacles. They relied on the victims' testimonies, the evidence.
The media.
The public pressure.
So despite everything, the truth.
Yeah, to a certain extent, yes. It took years, the trial. Years. But some of the accused were convicted.
Even the high-profile ones.
Some of them. And sentenced to prison.
Wow. It's a sign that even with power,
you can't escape the consequences.
But for the victims and their families, it must have been a bittersweet victory.
Right. Some measure of closure, but nothing can erase what happened.
They'll carry that with them.
Always.
Did any of this lead to changes?
In Jalgaon, in India.
I mean, did it spark a conversation about abuse, about power?
Yeah, it did. It became a wake-up call for India.
Really?
To confront these uncomfortable truths.
About
society.
Yeah.
How power is abused, how vulnerable people, especially, young women, from disadvantaged backgrounds, they're silenced, exploited.
So it was a
reckoning.
Socially, culturally.
It went beyond the legal battle.
So were there tangible outcomes to this conversation?
Legislatively.
Yeah.
There were changes.
To the laws.
To strengthen laws against child sexual abuse. Trafficking. They reviewed existing laws, amended them, introduced new legislation to protect victims.
Hold perpetrators accountable.
Exactly.
But laws aren't always enough.
Bro, you need a shift.
In attitudes.
And it's society.
A willingness to challenge the norms, the power structures. Did that happen?
It did spark a conversation, a national one. Patriarchy, the norms that silence victims. protect abusers.
So the media coverage, the public outcry,
The activists, the NGOs,
it all...
raised awareness about how widespread this is.
Yeah.
Sexual abuse, exploitation.
So it was about more than just laws. It was about...
challenging the system that allowed this to happen.
Were there changes in how these issues were addressed, how victims were supported?
Definitely. They focus more on support services, more funding for shelters, counseling, legal aid.
And for the...
Law enforcement,
Yeah.
improved training, sensitize officers to the complexities of these cases.
So that victims...
Are treated with empathy, respect,
Important steps.
towards a safer environment for women, children.
But the fight continues, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's an ongoing battle
Yeah.
to challenge power, change attitudes, create a culture of accountability.
Well, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive.
Into the Jalgaon Sex Scandal.
That's a tough one.
A reminder of the darkness that can exist, even in ordinary places, and how power can corrupt.
We've covered the legal fight, the victim's courage, and the struggle for accountability.
But the biggest takeaway
Baby.
is the conversation it started.
The awareness.
The push for change that continues today.
It shows that even against powerful forces,
Individual voices matter. Collective action can create change. Lasting change.
Thank you for joining us for CrimePod Castle.
Unsolved Mysteries of India. Remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe for more.
Explorations into India's dark side.